This is Dr. Dru Johnson from the Center for Hebraic Thought, host of the Biblical Mind podcast, and today we have an episode that's a little bit different than our usual episodes. This is a panel discussion that was hosted at the King's College on the topic of civility, and specifically having civil discourse with people with whom you might have very radical disagreements. The panel consists of Dr. David Tubbs, who's a constitutional scholar here, Dr. Anthony Bradley, who is a religious studies scholar, Professor Alissa Wilkinson, who's also, you might know her as a film critic at Vox.com, but she's also a full-time professor here at the King's College, and myself. It was a good discussion, and actually, minus my own comments into the discussion, I learned a lot from my colleagues here, and so we wanted to share this with you all. I hope you enjoy.
This is the Biblical Mind podcast, produced by the Center for Hebraic Thought. Honest 5-star reviews help others find this podcast. Visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org for articles and videos that explore the deep structures of Scripture.
So our discussions panel comes at the end of a really tense and polarized election season. It's showing us that we generally view the other side as stupid, selfish, or ignorant. But we're called to a higher standard as citizens and as believers. It was called the loyal opposition, which refers to the idea of having an opposing party in government, which remains loyal to the main source of power, but engages in politics in a way that keeps their opponent's good in mind. Civility like this in politics has become really rare. So talking about it is a good way to begin reconciling our political divide. So now if you'll turn your attention over to our moderator, Dr. Tubbs. He's an associate professor of politics at King's. He's been teaching here since 2005, and he's a faculty advisor to SBA. Dr. Tubbs, thank you.
Thank you. So I wanted to thank everybody who put this together, and we're especially grateful for the fact that questions were prepared. And after discussing the matter with Julia, we thought that we would give the panelists a kind of softball question to get started. 90 seconds. How do you understand civility with special reference to politics? Professor Wilkinson.
So I don't like the word civility very much at this point because I feel like it's often been emptied of meaning. It's sort of used as a weapon, sort of like the word unity sometimes is, I think, to say like you have to be civil without really knowing what it means. But with what I think it's meant to mean and what I think it should mean is something like respect, and something like respect for people, even if we don't have respect for their ideas. So that's a big part of it. And then I also think, and I'll probably bring this up because I've been writing a book chapter on Hannah Arendt, but it's something about respecting and loving people for how they are different from you and understanding that that shades how they see the world. So those two pieces together start to bring us towards civility, I think, when we're talking about politics. So I'll stop there.
Dr. Bradley?
I would probably want to frame it in terms of mutuality, to sort of situate ourselves to be mutually centered toward the other person's good. And that when we're actually seeking within the context of the pursuit of the other's flourishing, the other's thriving, and we care about the other person, that's going to help us frame and shape the way in which we go about this activity called discourse. When I'm really other-centered rather than me-centered.
Dr. Johnson?
I would just say yes to both of those. I would only add or maybe shade it a little bit and say the kind of civility that I think we want, or I'd say the biblical authors are often talking about, is the kind that also has humility in it, which means even no matter how deep my convictions run, I kind of have this constant sense that I might be wrong, or I might have gotten it wrong, or slightly misunderstood what's going on. So,
Okay. Very good. So I'd like to share Dr. Innes's thoughts on this topic. He was kind enough to write them down for us. And as Julia pointed out, he can't be here. He has to attend, sadly, a funeral today. But this is what he wrote. Civility is like good manners. It's the minimal requirement for living with other people in peace. When a friend reports that someone's behavior wasn't exactly friendly but merely civil, we understand what he means. Perhaps a disagreeable relative at Thanksgiving dinner, a lone Trumpist, or a lone progressive. Uncle Jack was not hostile, belligerent, offensive, or provocative, but restrained, polite, and conflict avoiding. Think also of how John Locke describes civil society, minding your own business and respecting other people's persons and property. This is the minimum for life together. No requirement for love, no sacrificial giving, no dying to self. It's how the city of man has learned to get along in peace. On social media, this requires self-restraint if we value the relationship, even just as fellow human beings, over the chance to shine with a good singer. In conversation, it requires respectful tone and forms of address, patience, listening, and being able to restate the other's position in a way that he or she would affirm. Civility is not Christian love, but Christian love requires at least civility. So that's Dr. Innes' view. Nicely stated. Okay. So one quick follow-up question for the three panelists here. Is there a movement or an event in history that you think provides particular insight on political civility?
Yeah, I can start. So I mentioned Hannah Arendt, and so there's many, but this is sticking in my head because I've been writing about her and her circle. So she was, a political philosopher in the 20th century. She is a Jew who had to flee Germany, her native country. When the Nazis came to power, she and her husband landed in New York, and she taught at Columbia, and there's many other things I could say about her, but I get very interested in the way that she thought about friendship, and I'm tagging this to her historical time, which is she and her friends often disagreed and often agreed, and these were many of the kind of famous intellectuals of her time, but they always... They made a point of eating together and drinking together. Lots of drinking together, actually. But they made a point of doing that together. And from that sprung something that you can see in her writing, which is her understanding that friendship is the place where we learn how to enter politics with respect and love, both for the world and for one another. And she said that friendship is the thing that subverts totalitarianism. So for her, totalitarianism of all kinds is subverted in the act of friendship. And friendship isn't something that requires us to be the same, and friendship is not a place in which we become more the same. It's where we actually reaffirm our differences. But we do it in an act of love, and that teaches us how to go into the public square. So I have been thinking a lot about her cocktail parties as a historical moment in which she was forming this idea that's actually become quite influential and is radical, I think. It doesn't fit neatly into any of the ideological kind of buckets that we like to stick people into. There's a good movie about this, of course, if you want to see it, from a few years ago, called Hannah Arendt. They actually reconstructed her actual apartment on Riverside Drive for the movie, so you can see what it was like. But yeah, I mean, I thought a lot about that because I think it forms a framework for many other places where civility was born over a meal, whether it was like activists during the civil rights era or, people fighting for workers' rights or suffrage or any of those things throughout the 20th century. There's this centrality to meals that's really interesting to me and how they cause you to form a friendship.
Very good. Dr. Bradley.
So if you watch the footage during the civil rights movement, the interviews of Malcolm X, the interviews of King, if you watch the interviews later on with James Baldwin and William F. Buckley, for example, what will you see? You'll see vehement disagreement but also mutual respect. And that was situated in a context where the expectation is, well, we already know we're going to disagree, but we're going to listen to each other first. And I'm amazed, even in the height of the civil rights movement, that King and Malcolm X, when they were often in conversation with those if they disagreed, they exercised a lot of restraint and calm in their speech. You also saw civility just in the movement for nonviolent resistance. If you think about the footage during the civil rights movement, what you'll see are my parents' generation being both verbally and physically attacked, but not responding in kind. They actually responded with nonviolent resistance. And that they had to be trained, by the way, to do that. Many people don't know that, but you had to go to nonviolent resistance training school in order to exercise those virtues. So to me, that's a clear historical example that you can go to YouTube and watch and see what it looks like.
Dr. Johnson?
I don't think I want to add anything.
Okay. So if I just extrapolate from your two examples, does civility in politics provide any guidance for us in colleges and universities? Because the polarization in the academic world is sometimes as acute as in the political world.
I mean, yes, obviously, right? So I think this is a huge topic that we could spend days unpacking, but I think in brief, the beautiful thing about college is that it's actually acceptable to it was when I was in college, which was not that long ago, acceptable to kind of play with ideas and to even live them for a little and kind of try them on and see if they work out. And I think one place that this happens, maybe the only place this really happens effectively is within friendships, intentional relationships in which we argue. And arguing is not uncivil behavior. It can become uncivil, but it isn't by nature non-civil. And on top of it, one nice thing about college is that we're kind of basically on the same playing field. It's not completely on the same playing field, but there's a kind of equality among the people who are here. And so we can have those conversations, understanding, hopefully, that like Dru was saying, I'm not finished with my conclusions. And there is, I can say as someone, I've been teaching 12 years and you guys have been teaching longer, and I know, isn't that crazy?
Are you serious?
Yeah, I know.
Wow, you're old.
I can say that, from our perspective, it's really beautiful to see students who have entered that feeling of humility and of not being sure where they land, because the worst thing is someone who's absolutely certain at 18 of everything, because I'm not absolutely certain, and that's bad, but also because this is the place where that's available to you. So when we talk about free speech on campus, then we start to run into issues of both people who don't want to hear anything that bothers them, and on the flip side, people who feel like they should have the freedom to say whatever they want at any time without respect for others. And there's something somewhere in the middle that hopefully a Christian campus can model for the outside world. But I think just on a student-to-student level, it's so wonderful that we can live in that space together and know that, from a kind of role perspective within the institution, now I'm talking PCI terms, but in that institution, we have that freedom because that's the role you're in right now, is to have that uncertainty and that kind of learning, and to be able to do that in the context of friendship.
Dr. Bradley?
That's great. So the question is, should politics be some sort of model?
Can we learn something about civility in academic
Absolutely.
life from
Yeah, sure. I would say we used to be able to do that. That ended really in the 1990s. The relationship between Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich was the beginning of the end of that. If you look at the relationship between Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, what did you see? he saw two.
Explain to them who those two people are.
Well, hopefully one house knows
Yeah.
who Ronald Reagan is.
They don't know good old Tippy.
Tip O'Neill was the House Majority Leader.
Speaker of the
He was Speaker of the House. And so Democrat, and he's from
Massachusetts.
Right?
From Massachusetts, Massachusetts.
Long time speaker.
Yes.
Long time Speaker of the House. And so he, blue blood Democrat, and Ronald Reagan, sort of California Republican. They disagreed on lots of things, but they were also friends. And they hung out together. They drank together. Their kids were friends. And in Congress in the 80s, that's what you saw. You saw Democrats and Republicans hanging out together, being friends, having meals, kids knowing each other. And in the 90s, that's when that ended. The relationship between Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich severed civility in politics. And so, unfortunately, what's been modeled since the boomers yet destroyed another institution. It's been a really poor model. So this is what I would recommend for students to do. This is sort of see what it used to be like. Look at the debates, the presidential debates in the 70s. Look at the ones in the 60s, and you'll see a level of statesmanship that was intentional. We are going to sort of help shape what the discourse should be like for the nation by modeling it right here on this television program or on this radio interview. So I think we can look back at sort of politics past and see that. I'm not really hopeful that politics going forward should be the model because of the polarization that we see today. And I think that Christians have an opportunity within the context of the church to model something radically different, because hopefully our churches are ideologically diverse as well.
I'd like to, as moderator, exercise a prerogative and ask you a follow-up question.
Please.
Because of a lot of time that Dr. Bradley spent in the UK. So the phrase loyal opposition, it actually comes from British politics. And as Juliet said, if you have one party controlling with the majority in the House of Commons, the other party is commonly described as a loyal opposition. My question for you is, do you think, and I'm guessing given all the time you spent in Northern Ireland and so forth, you've watched debates in the House of Commons, do you think what we see in the House of Commons, sometimes really testy debates, spirited debates, do you think that that's a model of civility that could be instructive for us in the United States right now with respect to politics?
Yeah, I mean, it's somewhat theatrical, right? There's a bit of theater there, right? It's sort of good spirited. It's almost a sport, right? And so what everyone knows is that the real work of politics and policy happens outside of off the floor. It's over meals. It's over, you're in a tavern. Like, that's where the real work gets done. And what we see, in one sense, is sort of standard political theater. And so I think what we don't see, which would be helpful to see, are those relationships that are outside Parliament, because that's where the work gets done. I was in Northern Ireland recently at Stormont, which is the sort of Northern Irish Parliament building, and right off the floor, go upstairs, right off the floor of the main room there is this massive restaurant. Because what happens is, after they debate issues, they go upstairs and they eat together and talk these things out further. And that's the part I think we don't see. But it's all in sort of good jest, and they don't take it personally. Why is that? Because they have relationships outside of that. Right? So I think that helps just to facilitate progress.
Dr. Johnson, civility in the academic world. Politics, could that serve as a model? Other sources, biblical sources to promote civility in academia?
Well, I don't think we should go biblical yet. I mean, there's a joke in academic, even in biblical studies. Why are the arguments so violent, vehement within biblical studies? Because the stakes are so low, right? Which is true of a lot of academic disciplines.
Film criticism.
Yeah, same. And just to put a finer point on it, I've actually heard a political historian who said this. When you go back to the 80s, why did it look like that? What happened? And actually, he said the main thing that happened is congressmen and women quit living in D.C. They basically moved to mainly their districts. They spent most of their time fundraising their districts. They no longer lived and ate and worked together. So they spent these very isolated amounts of time in combative states only. And that's essentially what this person thought was the genesis of a lot of the problems in Congress. So going back to that shared meal, shared life community, even in academia, my closest colleague who I work together with in the international scholarly community is an atheist from South Africa. Former Christian, very devout atheist, knows why he's an atheist. We're very good friends. We're close personal friends. We've had to talk each other off the cliff a couple times. But I think, and some people are surprised by that, some people aren't, but I don't know why anybody would be surprised unless you thought, like, my goal was to convince him that he's wrong about everything. So I think the thing that we appreciate about each other is, A, we learn from each other. I learn more from him than he does from me. But I think also in academics, well, and just in life, I've gotten into debates with atheists, like the annoying kinds of atheists that read websites and try to convince people on what they read. Like, same with Christians, right? And I realized that they weren't debating me; they were debating a caricature because they thought that I was trying to convince them that Christianity is correct. Versus, I was actually just trying to have a discussion and figure out what they thought and figure out if it just made sense. And I assumed that I might learn something new from them or learn something I'd never thought of before, and then I'd have to rethink what I thought in light of it. So I think people are very sensitive to that. Sniffing out, do you already have an answer in mind and all we're doing is you're just trying to get me to your answer? Or are you genuinely interested in me and my person, my experiences, and us sharpening each other? I will say, I didn't have anything but the historical experience because the only historical thing that I think is interesting, or the one that keeps coming to my mind, is the yeshivas, this Jewish training. You have a chavruta, which is an arguing partner. You literally go line by line through the Talmud, this commentary on Scripture, and you read what the rabbis say, and then you argue out what you think they meant. That's what you do every day for 6 years, 7 years. Not to actually go on forever, because there's no graduation from the yeshiva. You have to willingly leave. It's like the Navy SEALs. But you see the effects of it. It's not an accident that you have lots of really good Jewish lawyers if they've been through the yeshiva system. But you see it in the culture as well. It's okay to argue and almost look like you're going to put a knife to each other's throat. And then at the end of the day, you have lunch together, you calm down, everything's fine. I think that and I think we're going to see it more, if Dr. Bradley and I are correct in our assessments, that ability to argue without taking things personally is a skill. I mean, we could learn from the civil rights movement. Maybe we need to go through training now of the ability. I've been told by my wife and my family that I have this annoying habit of arguing for things I don't actually believe in. I'm just arguing because I'm trying to figure out whether I believe in it. I want to hear the best argument against it. But I sound like I know what I'm talking about, and I sound like I actually believe in what I'm talking about. So that apparently really ticks off a lot of people when you do that. But I do think there is a desperate need for this ability to not take it personally and to actually be able to work things out through argument, where it doesn't spill over into personal attacks on each other. I think we just lost the skill, we lost the art.
So all three of you said that a kind of dogmatic certitude is a significant obstacle to civility in political discussion. Can you identify any other obstacle or potential obstacles to civility politics? Dr. Johnson, you did a good job. So, Dr. Bradley, other obstacles to, or potential obstacles to civility in politics?
I have one that I think I haven't brought it up in class yet. So here in PCI, this is a spoiler, but I wish I had this written down, but there was a study done 50 years apart where researchers asked parents if they would rather have their children marry someone of another religion or of another political party. And in like the 50s or 60s, the answer was like, I don't care what political party my kid's spouse is, but I want them to marry in the same faith that I raised them in. And today it's the opposite. So, it flipped like from like 80 and 20 to like 20 and 80. So it's something has happened, obviously. And so to me, I think the biggest obstacle I see is this like, this turning of politics into religion, where like we bend our lives around and we bend our identities around our politics to the point where that's our first and primary like way to, I mean, you know, our rituals go around it, right? Our community, the way we kind of visualize who we are. And doing it in such a, you know, because religion is different than politics, or it should be. And so I think that's a huge obstacle, because suddenly you're asking me not to like consider your idea, but to like convert to your religion and like change my cosmology. And that is really dangerous. I always tell this story, which is just very funny. My father, loveliest, kindest man on earth, but was really into listening to talk radio when I was a kid, and in particular, really into Rush Limbaugh. And so we would listen to it with him when he was driving around. And then my little brother, one day, I was very young, I was 10, and we had dressed him up for a skit we were doing about Christmas, the Christmas story. And he didn't like the costume we put on him to play Joseph. And he said, "Do I look like Joseph or a little Democrat?" And it was like, oh, I see what's happened here. Even at that young age, I was like, oh, that word has come to symbolize something that doesn't actually. It's just descriptive of a set of views, right? But it becomes attached to like an identity. And I think the identity, I know we talk about identity politics a lot, but I think tying identity politics to your political party has become a real problem for civil discourse.
Very good.
Yeah, to that point, you know, I think it'd be great if at King's there was a class that freshmen took where they talked about politics becoming religion, and we went through a bunch of ideologies. Just maybe we'll do that someday. So that King's students are up on that discourse as well, perhaps. They wouldn't take it; they'd have to be forced to take it. For sure. David Coises, by the way. So I think, you know, I would say that what immediately popped up was the word proximity. Mm-hmm. And so there's which speaks to your point, right? We geographically polarize. There's a great book called The Big Sort that sort of described in the 1970s and 80s when we actually packed up our families and moved away from people who were politically and ideologically different from your version of us. And so we just don't know each other. We just don't talk to each other. And what the social psych data shows is that when you, in the context of a relationship, you're much less likely to demonize someone with whom you disagree when A, there's a relationship, and then secondly, when you understand why they believe what they believe. Right? They're not crazy, they're not Martians, right? They're not like evil demons, but you just don't know their rationale, and so it takes time and proximity, closeness to facilitate that. And so as long as there are red counties and blue counties, this problem is going to continue. As long as there are red neighborhoods and blue neighborhoods, as long as there are blue churches and red churches, this is going to continue to be a problem. In the 1950s, it was common, and this probably speaks to your point as well. It was common in any Protestant church, right, that you would have Republicans and Democrats in the pew together. And by the time we got to probably the mid-1980s, that was over. Churches became red or
Can I add to that?
Please.
That the internet was supposed to fix this, and instead it's made it worse because of the algorithms that flatter our sense of self, which you know if you've taken a media theory class, but it's an important point to make, which is that our perceptions of the world are so hopelessly skewed at this point that we are fighting literally machines, built by humans, but machines tuned to make money off of us if we're trying to find out what anyone else thinks.
Yeah. Watch The Social Dilemma if you haven't seen it.
Okay, so we're beyond the halfway point, so I think it would be appropriate now to ask the audience if you have comments or questions for the panelists. We have further questions here that we can continue. I can continue to ask the panelists, but we do want to involve you in this conversation. So, any comments or questions from the floor? Yes.
Yeah, it's funny that you guys mentioned like the geographic spreading, because almost the reason I decided to come to New York is because where I live was literally just a Christian conservative bubble. And being here has just been able to be such a blessing to see all the different worldviews that happen and that people hold. But one of my biggest things is like the whole point about civil discourse is to like show that you care about the person, you actually really think about them while you guys have different beliefs. But how do you go about having that civility when, say you have a belief that someone sees as directly harming them? How do you convince them that you actually do care about them when they see that you're doing just directly against them?
So welcome to parenting. This will be about 25 years of your life at some point if you get married and have children. So I was going to throw in here at some point, when we say arguing and civility and hearing and learning from somebody, it can also mean believing also that they think they're wrong, right? That they're flat wrong, and actually that the implications of their belief might have deleterious effects for them or other people. So I think it's fine to have, I think everything we're saying is right and good and true for proper and civil discourse. But I think there is I was going to mention it sometime, because if we go biblical, we actually have to talk about incivil or uncivil discourse. I don't know which one is correct. Incivility?
Incivility.
Yeah. Because the prophets are, spoiler, if you haven't read the prophets, they use all kinds of sexually grotesque analogies. They use all kinds of poop and urine analogies to describe. And, I love Amos because he calls the women who are oppressive and rich, you cows of Bashan, which might be in the first instance of a man calling a woman a cow. But they're not civil at all, right? And in fact, they use the most lewd metaphors and description they can to drive home the point. I'm going to make you eat your own shite and drink your own pee, right? Because of what you did. And so the question is, why would God send prophets to say those kinds of things to people? What flips them over from come on guys, we can do like Toby Flenderson into Dwight Schrute. And I think the answer is going to be this issue of when what you're doing exploits the vulnerable, really harms people in ways. The problem, this is where you try, but then they flip over to this mode all right, God actually is not going to tolerate this. This is problematic, and you need to hear how problematic this is. I think that this also coincides with the Bible's general view that we need lots of wisdom and discernment as you go down these roads, right? How much do you use the goads to kind of help tap people along? How much are you right? I think all of these conversations, you should constantly be checking yourself. Do I have this sorted out? Is this correct? Right? It's not bad. I think a lot of older people, which I guess I now count myself as one, I think it's true to say most of us, we find ourselves loosening our grip on a lot of things that we dogmatically believed 10, 20 years ago, but also simultaneously tightening our grip on a few things that we think are core, right? And so I think using that wisdom to think about what's core, when should you flip over and say, actually, I love you, we can be civil, we can have this discourse, but you're wrong, and I'm going to politically act against you because of what you've given. So, and you can do that in love as well.
Dr. Bradley.
I was going to talk about wisdom, so okay, good. Prudence, it's a virtue. Use it.
Yeah.
Get it. Use it.
Get it. Use it.
Love it. Live it.
Love it. Embrace it.
It sounds like that song now.
Yeah.
What song?
Not that one.
Additional comments, questions? More, please.
We had a question come in online.
Okay, sure.
So sophisticated.
Someone asked, this is slightly similar to the one we had, but how would you promote argument without taking things personally and without turning to the extreme of facts, not feelings discourse? Because like feelings and individual perspectives are really intricately bound to the practice of debate. So how would you walk the line of turning the focus of attention away from yourself without feeding into the fallacy of just facts?
We'll avoid your mom references. I mean, me, myself, I would just say, like, look, the research is in. Rational arguing is emotional all the way through. So math has an emotional aspect to it. Like, there's actually been studied. You can't do math without emotions. It's literally impossible. To misuse the word literally.
Which, by the way, she hates.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's true.
So I think to argue with someone and take the whole person, not take the whole person seriously, but start segmenting him into bits and be like, oh, leave your emotional side behind you or whatever. I just don't know that ever works. If you have somebody, I think what Dr. Bradley said, everybody believes something for a reason. No matter how unreasonable the ultimate belief is or how disconnected it might be with reality, there's a good reason why they believe it. Nobody believes things randomly unless they have a mental health disorder that causes that. So thinking about what are the experiences in their life or the reasons that they're piling together to make this thing work in their mind is probably more helpful. And I think people can, on the whole, see when you're trying to do that versus when you're trying to just slice them and dice them so that you can get to where you want to go anyways.
I would say, first of all, don't argue on Twitter. It's a good rule.
That's so
or
true.
Social media at all. I just
Especially
don't
with
believe in
Baptists.
it anymore. I think very few things that are good ever happen with arguing.
Could you explain why, elaborate why?
Yeah.
You think it's a bad idea?
Well, first of all, Twitter's 280 characters. Secondly, it's disembodied. Even if you know the person, there's something that happens in the kind of interaction there, which isn't to say that disembodied communication is always bad. Writing letters is great. That's a thing people used to do. It's very effective. But social media, again, they're monetizing your argument. So just don't give it to them. And by them, I mean like the companies that are monetizing your argument. Second, it's just better to say, hey, I really want to talk to you about this because I'm trying to sort through everything that I hear you saying, and can we take this offline or not offline, I guess, but can we email about it or something like that? Also, it's effectively just yelling at someone in a crowded room while everyone else sits around and listens annoyed. It's just bad. I don't think people should do it. I think it's fine to make statements, but I don't engage in arguments, ever, especially now. So that's one big thing. And the other thing that, from a real practical perspective that I think is really important is starting the conversation by saying, I want to make sure I really understand what you are saying. Would you please describe for me what it is you're saying and why? And making sure that you thoroughly understand what their position is before you do anything resembling reacting to it. Because you would want the same thing, right? Like you don't want someone being like, oh, you're a Christian, so you think X, and so, this is bad and you're bad, and next thing I won't back to listen to anything you say, whatever that might look like. And so I think, paying someone the courtesy of saying, like, I actually don't want to react to you till I know what it is that you think. And then that slows it down. It slows the whole thing down. It takes some of the heat away. And it makes it into that conversation. And I think fundamentally those two things change a lot. And it's the opposite of what we see on social media. And again, I don't think there's anything wrong with seeing in a news article that someone said something false and posting it and saying, this is false, this is how we know. That's not arguing on Twitter, that's just making a statement. But as soon as you start arguing, it's just a bad thing.
Can I ask a question? There's Steve too, because he actually gets into this more than you do, but can it be civil to say, I'm not going to talk to you about this in this forum?
Yeah.
I mean, because it feels to that person like you're dismissing them, because we all have these people who write us these hateful emails.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And I get.
It took me a long time to learn. There are certain people that are just not
Constantly.
working.
We should have a do a panel about that.
Yeah, I should just read my hate mail. I mean,
Yeah.
especially,
Hers.
frankly, if you're not a white man on the internet, you get more hate mail. That's just
Why are you
proven.
coming after me? This is the hate mail.
So you get plenty of hate mail. But yeah, you have to sometimes just learn that, actually, sometimes people are just like expressing their feelings and you don't have to reply.
If you're unwilling to participate in a forum with someone, you typically give a reason why.
Yes.
I do.
Okay,
Yeah.
so the person is not mystified, like what?
I mean, I've been asked to go on and do debates on YouTube or whatever. And I'm just like, I can't do it. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Could I jump
You
in
will
here?
not enjoy it. I will ruin your YouTube
I
channel.
want to briefly address the question. I think it's important sometimes to ask more questions than it is to make dogmatic or declarative propositional statements. Because what I tend to find is that when people are emotionally vehement about a position, there's almost always a story back there.
Yeah.
And so you think you're arguing about a policy, and that person is thinking about their grandmother or something like that, right? And which is why there's like such an emotional attachment, because it's not a principled argument. It's an argument situated in a narrative. And so when you ask more questions, like, well, what makes you say that? Well, why do you think that? Where'd you get that from? Often you can get to the story, and then you can have the conversation, right? And so asking more questions, asking lots of questions, I think is a really good way to sort of smooth things out.
Yeah.
I think of two examples from 20th century history. In the United States in the 1930s and 1940s, when word started to leak out and more American intellectuals knew about the crimes of Stalin, there were instances in which people who used to belong to the Communist Party of the United States broke with the party, and they would not associate anymore with people who were still defending Stalin. And there are a few examples of men refusing to shake one another's hand because they just said, this is, you've gone too far. A second point related to what Dr. Johnson was just saying, there's a well-known historian at Emory University, and she's written a book on Holocaust denial. And she has said, I will appear at pretty much any scholarly function in which we talk about interpretations of the Holocaust, but I will not show up to an event in which the facts are, so to speak, up for grabs. She said, I don't want to lend any legitimacy to Holocaust deniers. And she said, the historical evidence is the factual evidence is overwhelming. Nothing is served intellectually by showing up at such a function. So interpretations, yes, let's discuss. Basic facts, no.
Yeah, I think that point about what happens with people who had been communists who kind of moved away once what came out is a really good one, because it's always been fascinating to me to think about what that would look like, or will, because it probably will happen in our lifetimes, and whether the polarization that we currently experience would make them hew even harder to their position. Maybe not intellectuals, I don't know, but I feel uneasy when I see some of the ways that people have drifted over the past 4 years to being even more supportive of things that they in past lives would not have supported. Because, again, I think they've tied their identity to something rather than thinking of, I don't think we should think about politics in people's lives as a thought experiment, but I think it's okay to put it where, like, we can look at it with a level of detachment that lets us say, like, this isn't about me. And it's so narcissistic, right? Like, what happens in DC is not about you. It is, but it isn't. Right?
I think people they long for some sort of meeting system. right? To kind of provide a lens through which they can interpret reality. And right now, in a culture that has sort of purged religion, different religions, right, is sort of framing those meaning systems, right? It's not the sort of Catholics and Jews and all these religious groups are talking about policy and the culture. Now you have you sort of in this currently, right? Not so much emphasis on religion. So now what's going to bind us together? It's not schools anymore, right? It's not churches anymore, right? It's not even hometown, home state, family name, clan. All those things we don't really identify and build community around those things anymore. And so we use politics as this sort of meaning system, and that really erodes so much of the discourse that we could be having. And I think it makes people vulnerable to go even deeper down the rabbit hole because they want more meaning, right? And then when you sort of tribalize the discourse, it kind of becomes this sort of isolated, sort of self-producing narratives of containment where people don't even realize they're in the matrix.
And any yucko who pops his head up and says, I know how to go forward, people will just galvanize around.
Yep.
More comments, yes, great.
So Dr. Bradley, you mentioned sort of political discourse back in like this, the 60s and 70s and up until the early 90s, how there was some level of civility among people who were having in terms of debate. And so that they were sort of modeling that for the people that were watching. But I'm wondering, and I guess this is sort of for all three of you, how do you see, how does that interact with, is it that the politicians are modeling and then we are seeing that, or are they largely reflecting the sort of atmosphere that already exists out in the broader society so are they leading the way, or are they simply reflecting what's already occurring against the electorate in society?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's sort of a chicken egg question, right? It's probably some combination of both of those things. But I would say though that if you watch Firing Line with Buckley, for example, I think that program, I think they were intentionally modeling something with that PBS program. In fact, if you watch the news hour on public television, which is where I primarily get my news instead of the bigger networks, they're actually trying to do something different when they tell the story of the news. Like, so when they report stories, you're going to get both sides of everything. It's slow, it's boring, right? There are no commercials, but it's intentional.
The news anchors aren't good looking.
Nope, they look like the rest of us, right? They're just normal looking people, right? There's no zingers, there's nothing sensational about it at all. And so, by the way, and this is, I guess, this is my kind of own nerddom. I mean, when I was in high school, I used to watch like Washington Week in Review on public television because that's what they did. You saw a bunch of adults, right, sitting around a table having really good a discourse and disagreeing, and so there is some modeling and there is some reflecting, and I guess. When does the modeling begin and when does the reflecting end? I'm not clear on what that is, but I do know that there's some platforms that are actually coaching people, right, in terms of the form. And this is why YouTube is such a dumpster fire, because it's actually modeling for many people really poor discourse. Right? But some of that's actually reflecting what people are already like, right? So it's sort of feeding back into itself. So I would say yes and no on both ends. Just to clarify.
Can I make a quick follow-up? Yeah. He mentioned, Dr. Bradley mentioned a famous show that ran on public television for many years called Firing Line. And the host was William F. Buckley, who died about 12 years ago, a noted conservative author, the founder and editor of National Review, for many, many years. And what Dr. Bradley said is true. William F. Buckley invited everyone who was either a politician or a public intellectual of some repute on the show. And the civility of the discourse, which is remarkable, and probing questions, nothing was really considered off limits because of the civility. So.
I also, just to the point, I mean, I did not watch these shows when I was in junior high or high school. But even me, who was drinking my way through junior high and high school, I remember in social studies, like my history professor, teacher, making the point, even about senators, what was the difference between senators and congressmen? You know, senators were the ones who actually acted in a very stately way. They're the ones who like held the line, you know, and they kind of look down their nose at congressmen like, oh, they do that over in Congress, but over here in the Senate, you know, here's how. So even that has some kind of indication that there was an intent to model a certain type of civility.
6-year terms, man.
Yeah.
Oh, I would only say, I guess, the media point is an important one. The history of TV news is bad in general, and it's worth acquainting yourself with why that happens. It has to do with policies enacted around what airwaves could be used for.
Recommendations from someone in the media?
Well, there's a doc about Roger Ailes that actually explains this very well.
Oh no, sorry, I meant for like good media outlets.
For good I don't think there's any good TV news aside from what's on PBS. I don't watch it. I had to watch some of it for the election, and I thought, this is every problem I can imagine. Okay. So my recommendation is to read your news from things that are longer than 1,000 words. And that's the best recommendation I have, thoroughly. So that is an issue. But I also just generally, I think like what you're saying is exactly correct. And I was tweeting about this last week, but if we take culture to be a system of truth claims and moral obligations class, or at least to start there, then we can say that what politicians model, especially when the politicians are like the characters on your television set, what they model tells us what those truth claims and moral obligations are. And when they model that you don't have a moral obligation to respect or even to like answer questions from people, then of course we're going to think that way. However, the reason they're there is because somebody liked what they were doing well enough to vote for them to be in that position. So it's cyclical, and there's not an easy fix, except courage for the people who shape that culture. And courage is in very short supply these days.
So we have just 3 minutes left. I wanted to conclude with a point, maybe a comment from the panelists or from the audience. I make the following as an observation. The vast majority of Americans are not political extremists. They're not extremists on the left, they're not extremists on the right. All of the discussion about civility in politics, I think, presupposes our interactions with non-extremists, which is the great majority of the American people. Nonetheless, I think the premise of this discussion is that for many of us, friendship with a person whose politics are very different from ours is surprisingly hard. So I just throw it out to you, are any of the students in attendance today finding it difficult to form or maintain friendships with people whose politics are very different? Anybody find this to be a challenge right now? You mentioned your friend, the atheist.
Yeah, I don't find this difficult at all.
You don't find it difficult at all?
And it's not because we avoid talking about things we don't agree about. It's just the premise of the relationship that we don't agree and that we can learn from each other.
Yeah.
Professor Wilkinson, Dr. Bradley, do you have friendships with people whose politics are very different from yours?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Of course.
Most of them.
Yeah, almost all, yeah.
I don't know a lot of people who would fall down the same on me as me on every subject.
Yeah, I mean, I go home for Christmas and stuff, so family, it's all over the place.
Yeah.
It's great. But no, even here in New York, I have very close Christian friends where we have good disagreements on policy. I have very close friends who are mainline Christians, and we have very deep disagreements across the board on lots of things. But there are things that matter more. And, these policy issues are somewhat temporal. And so because they're deeper things than the policy issues, we were able to have good friendships and talk things over. I had one friend, we had a minimum wage discussion for like over 3 years. Right? It's a lot of beer. I was drinking bourbon. There was a lot of alcohol and a lot of chicken wings to have that conversation. And it took 3 years. I'm not exaggerating. Just on minimum wage alone. So.
It took 3 years. I want you to finish the thought.
Yeah, to
For
do
you
what?
to convince him of the wrongness of his position.
Yes. Yeah. Well, actually, it took me 3 years. It took me 3 years for the person to say, I never thought about it like that before. That was the progress that was made. They're like, well, I guess, well, yeah, that's a good point. 3 years.
Yeah.
It took three.
Professor Wilkinson, something
All
comparable?
I'm going to say is that as a film critic, my job is to have friends who I disagree with vehemently about things, and I have learned so much from that, about arguing, about not taking it personally, all of those things. And I strongly recommend arguing about pop culture as a training ground for figuring out how to argue about other things without taking it personally. And unfortunately, pop culture conversations are getting colonized by partisanship and fandoms and all that stuff in the same way as politics is basically colonized by fandoms at this point, but it's a good place to start if you're finding it hard.
So on that somewhat hopeful note, looking at the time, I think we should conclude. So join me please in thanking
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.